Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from AlexMercedCoder.dev and devnursery.com and grokOverflow.com. Lots of places. I also do a lot of podcasts like Web Dev 101. You can click that subscribe button to make sure you keep getting these videos. Click that like button so that way more people get to see this stuff. But today what I'm going to do is a intro to Mongo and Mongoose for 2024. So this one's going to be probably about like an hour long. Okay, and again, there's Dev Nursery, where you can find lots of good resources and join the Discord and Slack communities. But what I would like to do is I'm going to head over to actually create an incognito window. So we can use a blank Excalibur drawing. Just want to kind of first talk about what is Mongo. Mongo is a document database. Okay, it's also a NoSQL database, just meaning it's not necessarily using SQL. It's not like a typical database. So your typical relational database tends to store data in the form of tables. Okay, so a table you can kind of imagine kind of like this. So, basically you have your rows. Of data. And then like each of these would have like a particular set of data. So it'd be like name, age, and actually let's just do ID at the front. Okay, and then basically each of these below would have sort of values. So, be record 1, Alex 38. Time flies by. Okay. So, and you just see kind of data sort of structured in this way. Okay, so imagine like an Excel spreadsheet. Okay. And this is great for certain types of use cases, particularly when you have data that's very heavily related to each other. But sometimes you just have a lot of data that you just need to have quick access to. So you don't need the extra sort of layers that relational databases add to make sort of to optimize for that relational layer. Okay, so then you have document databases. Now document databases, particularly Mongo. Okay, so let me just put the word over here. A document database. In this case, I'm speaking specifically about Mongo. There are other document databases, like AWS has DynamoDB. There's, I think, ScyllaDB is a document database. There are other choices, but they all have sort of different characteristics. The difference here is that like that same data would show up as be saved as JSON in a Mongo database, and it's a little bit more complicated than that, but we'll get there. So in this case, I would see like ID 1, a name, and this is not properly formed JSON. I do need the quotation marks to make it like proper JSON syntax. Okay, Alex, and age 38. Okay, and that would be an example of a single document. Now the benefit of this is this takes up a lot less space. Okay, so for example, let's say I had one record that, for one person who I didn't have their age. Well, then I just don't have that included in there. So then the document would look like this, which is going to take up less space. So you end up having much more sort of efficient usage of storage is one benefit of a document database, particularly Mongo. And not only does it use JSON to do this, but it takes that JSON and came up with a binary representation of JSON called BSON, aka binary JSON. So basically, since you're not text encoding that JSON, which would take up more space, that binary representation of JSON takes up less space. So you have this sort of nicer way of writing down your data that saves space, and then that is being represented in binary, which saves even more space. So Mongo allows you to save a lot of information in a small bit of space and access it really quickly, especially when the data is unrelated. You just need to go get this record, I need to go get this record, or all the related data is bundled in there. That's kind of how it's where it excels. Although in practice, a lot of people will use both databases as their main database for their applications. But essentially, just so you understand theoretically, what is the difference between these two relational database, like any SQL database versus a document database? Hopefully this kind of illustrates it. Now, the other thing I'd like to say is, again, either one can be used as your main application database. People do that all the time. Again, there will be places where one shines over the other. Both of them have both categories are constantly being developed and constantly being improved. But it's good to kind of know that there is this fundamental under the hood difference. Now, if you want to go get your own Mongo database, you should head over to MongoDB.com and, well, sign up, and you can get yourself a free cluster of database. I'm not going to go through that whole process of how to set that up. If you just sign up, it's pretty straightforward. Okay. Then you basically, all you'd have to then do is just basically whitelist all IP addresses and give yourself a username and password. And then you would have a working Mongo database that you can use for the exercises I'll be doing in this video. You could also just install Mongo on your computer, and you can just run a Mongo server on your computer, or you could actually run a Docker container with Mongo on your computer. And actually, I'm going to try that. I haven't done that before. I do have Mongo installed on my computer, and I don't think it's running at the moment. Okay, but I do have Docker Desktop installed, and I actually haven't used it particularly for Mongo. So if you have Docker Desktop installed, let's actually try this out. What I can do is I can go look up the Mongo container. So let's see here. Mongo, I just want a straight up MongoDB. Okay, can I look at the information for it? I'm going to assume that's it. Okay, let's see what it says. Web-based MongoDB admin interface. We're in Node.js. Oh, okay, so it's just literally like a web version. Okay, so I just want Mongo. There we go. Perfect. Okay, so then what I would do is I would click pull to pull that Docker image. Okay, and again, you can install Docker Desktop pretty easily by just going to docker.com and installing it. But again, just to show you an easy way to get Mongo running on your computer, I can just pull this image, which will take a second, so I'll let that download. Cool. Once it's done installing, I'll be able to run the container. So I'm going to run the container. And then here under optional settings, all I want to do is make sure I map that port. So basically, I'm just saying 27017 equals 27017 on my computer. And that should be it. So I hit run. Actually, before I do that, let me just double check the documentation here, just in case there's anything I do need to worry about. No, that should be good. Okay, so run 27017, and I hit run. And it looks like Mongo is running. Okay, so cool. Now, just to double check that it is working, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my terminal, and I'm going to type in MongoD, see, oh, not Mongo, I want to type in Mongo, see if I'm actually able to access it. Perfect. Okay, cool. Okay, that may or may not work for you, just because I have Mongo installed on my computer. So in that case, that CLI tool is already there. So when I type in Mongo, it's going to use that tool, but it's going to connect to that Docker container. So if this doesn't work, you may still want to go through the rest of this exercise to see if it's working now. How to quit? It's been a while. All right, I totally forgot how to get out of this. So I'm just going to close this terminal and just kill it. Okay. Yeah, just close the window. Okay. So now I have MongoDB running on my computer. Okay, so that's a shortcut way if you don't want to have to install it on your computer to have Mongo running if you just want to practice and experiment without setting up a whole online account. Although setting up a MongoDB account is pretty straightforward. Okay, cool. So again, the point of this video is to really focus on introducing Mongo and Mongoose. Mongoose is essentially going to be the way we talk to Mongo in the world of Node. Okay, so actually let me see, do I still have that other window open? Yeah, let's close that window. Let me go back to, oh no, that was the window where I had the Excalibur open. So let me go back to Excalibur for a moment. And what I want to just kind of point out here is that here you're going to have your Mongo database, which you can get from MongoDB.com or wherever. And basically how this talks to your application, well, every database generally has like a custom protocol. So in order to help other pieces of software that talk to that protocol, they generally create what's called a driver. A driver is just a piece of software that tells one piece of software how to talk to another piece of software or hardware. Okay, so there's the Mongo drivers. Now in Node, I could just use the raw Mongo driver. So if I go to npmjs.com, I can type in Mongo. Okay, and I think it would just be MongoDB was what I'm looking for. Yep, here we go. Here's the official MongoDB driver, and I could use this and just connect directly to the database and send raw queries to it using MongoDB syntax. Okay, which I'm not going to cover here. Although if you do want to learn more about the raw MongoDB syntax, if you go to docs.devnursery.com, okay, you click here on New Dev Docs, there is a MongoDB section. If you scroll down, there it is. That does go into sort of that syntax. Okay, I'm going to talk more about accessing it through JavaScript in this video. Okay, cool. But basically, most languages, generally you don't use the raw database driver just because it's oftentimes a little bit harder to use. So oftentimes people build what's called a document or an object manager, where you can map your different collections of data to objects that will help you interact with that data in your code. Okay, so for document databases, they're referred to as ODMs, Object Document Managers. And the most popular one for Node.js is Mongoose. Okay, so Mongoose is built on top of the Mongo drivers, and essentially that is what's going to enable you to talk to Mongoose from your JS application, your JavaScript application. So again, just to understand the layers, there's the database, which is a separate running thing. Then there's your app, that's a separate running thing, and they're able to talk to each other through Mongoose, which is built on top of the drivers, and this builds sort of the pipeline between the two. Okay, just so you can understand how all these pieces are fitting together and why we're doing things the way they are. Okay, so now that we have that sort of mental image, and a lot of this principles go for like any database. But now let's go back to VS Code and actually start writing some JavaScript. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new NPM project. So I'm going to open up my terminal. So again, this is not a JavaScript 101 or Node 101. So the expectation is that you are familiar with Node to a bit, maybe have written an Express app in the past, and are looking more to start learning how to use Mongo databases. And in general, once you watch this video, you should have a pretty good idea how you can go about learning any database. Okay, cool. So what I want to do is create a new node project. So that's going to be npm init-y. Okay, wonderful. Okay. And so I got my package.json. Now I want to install what I need, which is right now, all I need is .env, because I want to always save I always want to save my connection string, the URL to my Mongo database, in a .env file. You never want that in your code, because if you push that up to GitHub, then, well, people can access your database and run up your bill or destroy your data. You just don't want that happening. It's very sensitive information. So npm.env, and I'm going to want Mongoose, and I'm going to want, that's it for now. Well, we may, if we have time, go back to Express. Okay, so, I forgot to type in npm install.env mongoose. There we go. So now it's going to install that. Now, on top of that, I'm going to want to create a gitignore file to make sure I ignore that .env file, because again, I don't want to push that up to GitHub. So I'm going to use touch to create a file, .gitignore, and I might as well create my .env file while I'm at it. And I'm going to create a connection.js. That's going to be the file where we connect to Mongoose. Okay, or connect to Mongo using Mongoose. So now I'm going to go through first I'm going to go through my .gitignore file, and I just want to make sure I ignore my .env. And I should also ignore node modules, because we never want to upload that to GitHub either, if we can avoid it. Just a waste of space. Okay. Now in my connection.js, I can begin working with Mongoose. So just like any third-party node library, what I'm going to want to do is bring in the connection. So I'll do const mongoose equals require mongoose. Okay, and again, if you were to do a EJS module, actually what I'll do is I'll do the EJS module separately so you can see both. Okay, it's not going to be too much of a difference. But again, what I'm doing here is I'm going to import mongoose. Okay, in my .env, I'm going to want to put my database URL. Now, typically when it comes to the database environmental variable, the most standard name for your database variable is database URL. Now, again, does it have to be that? No, you can name your environmental variable whatever you want, but I would say in most contexts, oftentimes this is the variable name that'll be used for your database URL. Okay, and basically what happens, and just to kind of just give you sort of like the template, so like basically the template for a database URL is the following. Okay, it's protocol, so what kind of database. If you've seen like a URL like http// you'll kind of know how this works. Protocol, then you can put the username and password here if you need it. In this case, I won't need it because I'm running Mongo locally. Username and password. Then it would be the host, which would be like where the computer that's running the database server. And then you would put your database name, which could be anything. Okay, so that's typically the URL you're going to want. You can get that if you're using MongoDB.com. If you click on the connection option, it'll show you how to create this URL. And then you can go through database access to create your username and password for that database. Okay, now in this case, it would just be since I'm working with a local Mongo database, I should be able to just do MongoDB : // and then what I'm going to do is say no username, no password. So it's just 127.0.01. That is the IP address of the computer that you're on. 27017. And the database name will just be called today's database. Doesn't matter what you call it. Okay, so that's my database URL. So that's going to essentially give the information to Mongoose to be able to connect to my database. This goes for pretty much any database you can use of any type. You are able to construct these URLs in order to establish connections. So connection strings are very important, typically saved under the database URL environmental variable. Okay, so now that I have that, I can go back to my connection.js, okay, and I'm going to want to bring in my environmental variables. And the way I do that is I'm going to bring in .env equals require .env. Okay, and then I'm going to read the .env file, which is done by using .env.config. This function reads your .env file and will load up any variables in the .env file and load variables into process.env. I'm not going to get too deep into what the process object is. If you look at that docs.devnursery.com website that I just mentioned earlier, there is a node section that does get into what this process object is in more detail. It's a very useful part of Node if you're not familiar with it. So I recommend going back and reading that. But not important for right now. Just know that any environmental variables, this is where they're stored in Node. It's a little bit different in Deno, a little bit different in Bun, a little bit different across all languages. And it gets into that in docs.devnursery.com. But yes. So now that I have that variable available, I can now save it into its own variable. So I can say const database URL. So I'm going to create a variable called database URL and say it equals process.env.database URL. Okay, because again, when I ran this line, this variable from my .env file got loaded into this object. But I don't want to be typing this every time I need it, so I'm going to save it into its own variable. So I'm going to save database URL into its own variable. Okay, and with that, I can establish a connection. Okay, and the way I do that is you're going to take that mongoose that we imported earlier, and that has a function called connect, and then I just pass it the database URL. and that should work. But right now, if I run the file, I'll have no idea if it's successfully connected or not, because it's not going to immediately give me any output. Like basically, it just would be connected, and I would just have to imagine that it is. Okay, so in order for me to kind of get some feedback from my computer to know whether, hey, is this thing connected or not, what we do is that Mongoose has what's called an event emitter built into it, meaning during certain points when things are happening, it's going to emit events. So like when your connection is open, when your connection is closed, when you fail to connect, we can listen for those events in the same way that in the browser you can listen for a click or a form submission and then respond to those events. So what I want to do is that whenever a connection opens, I want to listen for that and print out a message so I know that the connection is open. When the connection disconnects, I would like to listen for that. And then if there's an error, I'd like to listen for that. Okay? So that's what I'm going to do, create these connection events. So that's all found through the mongoose.connection object. Okay? Now, basically what this does, this is the event emitter. Essentially, this is the event emitter object. And event emitter objects have a function called on that allows you to listen for the event. Now for cleanness, I'm going to put this on the next line. And the first event I want to listen for is open. And then the second argument is always a callback saying, hey, what do I want to do when that event is triggered? Okay, so in this case, what I want to do is console.log connected to Mongo. And then I can just chain more calls to .on off of that. So when the connection is, when the connection is closed, I want to say, and there's a couple different words, like you can use open, connected, close, disconnected. Okay, console.log disconnected from Mongo. So essentially when that event happens, that function is going to get triggered. And .on error. So if something goes wrong, this one's a little bit unique because this one actually receives the error. Okay, and then I can do what I want with the error. So in this case, all I really want to do is console.log the error. You might want to do something else with it. Okay, maybe you want to log it to a file and have an error log that separately gets generated, or no, not the string error. I want the actual error to be logged. Okay, and that's it. We've set up our connection. Now, basically what I'm going to do is just export the connection, module.exports. So this way I can use this connection in other files. What I do is I export the Mongoose object. So going forward, if I need it somewhere else, I'll import this version of Mongoose instead of doing the const require Mongoose up here. Okay, and now I can just use this connection object anywhere I need that connection established. But what I can do is I can just test if this is working first by just running this file. So I'll just do node connection.js. And since I have those those connection messages, if it connects successfully, I should see the connected to Mongo message. So let's see here, and perfect, we do. Okay, I see the connected to Mongo message. You may occasionally get these deprecation warnings. Okay, and when you see those deprecation warnings, if you're just practicing and learning how to use Mongo, you can, for the most part, ignore them. A deprecation just means that some part of something is being sort of phased out. So they're just warning you, hey, don't use this thing anymore because eventually we're not supporting it, so it could become insecure or unusable later. Okay? But so if you see any kind of deprecation warnings, for the most part, you can ignore them for the purposes of learning. Now, in a production environment, you'd want to be a little bit more attuned to those, but usually, unless you are the tech lead, you're going to have people on your team who kind of focus on taking care of those dependency type issues. And if it's a solo project, then you do some research to see if those issues are anything that particularly concerns you. Okay, but good. Our code is working. So I'm going to hit Control-C to close the connection because it's not going to close automatically. So Control-C will kill anything in your terminal that's running. So now we can begin using this connection. So what I'm going to do is that, well, generally the way you use the connection is you create what's called a model. So a model represents a type of data that you're tracking. Okay, so usually what we do is we'll create a file for our model, and models are usually named with an uppercase and singular. So in this case, we'll call it people.js. Okay, because this is going to be our, and actually should be singular, so that should technically that should be called person.js. Okay, so person.js, and then plural is people. Okay, so usually the convention is, and I'll put that as a comment right here at the top, the model is usually like person, and then the collection or table. So in a document database, a group of data, of similar data, is called a collection, while in a relational database, it's called a table. Think of it just like one Excel spreadsheet. Okay, so one spreadsheet in your Mongo database is called a collection, and usually would call that lowercase plural. So basically, the model people would have a collection called people. Okay, it might actually call it persons. It depends on the ODM. Some ODMs and ORMs for relational databases are really smart about that, and they can pick up when you have a weird plural word like goose and geese and stuff like that. Okay, but that usually would be sort of the concept there. Okay, now what I'm going to want to do is import not any Mongoose. I want to import the Mongoose from my connection.js. So I'm going to say, hey, const Mongoose equals require / connection. Okay, so again, I'm not importing a fresh Mongoose object, but the already established one. Okay, now with that, I can begin creating a model and a schema. So what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to, instead of typing in mongoose.schema and mongoose.model over and over again, what I can do is I can use a feature in JavaScript called destructuring, which allows me to pull things out of an object to pull out those individual pieces. So I can say, hey, const, the things I want to grab are schema and model. And that's exactly how they're spelled. It's got to be spelled exactly the way they're named in the library, because schema is a class, model is a function. Okay, and I'm going to pull those out of the Mongoose object. Okay, so this allows me to pull them into their own variable. In nice, pull out mongoose.schema and mongoose.model into their own variables. Okay, so now I have that. So now what I want to do is create the schema. The schema is essentially the rules or design of our data. Okay, so again, we're going to design a person. So we're going to say const person schema equals a new schema. And in that new schema, we're going to pass an object. And this object would be our properties, which we'll use the same properties we mentioned earlier. So it would be name, which will be a string, and age, which will be a number. Okay, now there's a second argument you can pass to schema. Okay, and what you can do here is there's a specific property called timestamps. And if you make timestamps equal true, it'll automatically add a created at and updated at property. This is really useful if you're tracking those changes, particularly especially if you're trying to implement something called slowly changing dimensions. Don't want to get too deep into data modeling here, but essentially like being able to track, like imagine like someone changes their address 30 or 40 times. You might want to be able to track those historical versions of the address. So you may have them as separate entries, but then you want to use the timestamp to figure out, hey, which is the latest address. But then if you want to take a look at where did they live 5 years ago, you have the timestamps to be able to figure out, hey, which is the right entry for that user or something. So that's the deal there. So again, that is my schema. I'm going to just save this so that way it formats it a little bit. Okay, now once you have the schema is just the rules. It's not the actual model. It's not the actual thing that's going to allow us to work with our data. We now need to create a model. And essentially, this is going to be the object that allows us to create, query, delete, and update data. And the way we do that is we create const person, because again, singular, plural, singular, uppercase, We use the model function. We have to pass a string with the model name, which should be the same thing, person. That's basically how it determines what the name is in the database. It's going to be basing it off what I pass here as that model name. And then basically when it saves data into that model, what rules should it use as far as how the data should look like? Well, that's the schema. So I got to pass it a schema for it to enforce. So now this object person will allow me to add data that follows the person schema. And I can go retrieve data that follows the person schema from a person collection that will be in my Mongo database. And then what we can do is we can then go export that. So module.exports. And that's just going to equal person. Okay, so now I have that available. Okay, we can now begin working with the data. So it's been a long journey, but here we are. Okay, but again, I'm taking the slow methodical approach so we can understand each step along the way. So now let's just create a query.js. This will be where we'll run our queries against our Mongo database. And again, this would be the kind of code you would write in your Express routes or your Koa routes or your Fastify routes or in any kind of application where you want to use Mongo. Okay, so the code I'm going to write here could just be written wherever. So I'm going to import my model. So const person equals require person dot slash person. And then I'm also going to require mongoose because I'm going to want const mongoose equals require dot slash connection. And again, the reason I'm going to want that is because I need to use that to delay the execution of my code. Now, usually in an Express app, your code is going to be written in a route, and your routes aren't going to automatically happen. So in that case, generally, like you'll be well connected to the database before that code runs. But this file, I'm just going to run arbitrary code. So there's no guarantee that my code is going to run before that connection is established. Okay, so in order to make sure that the connection is open, I'm going to use those mongoose events. So I'm going to say, hey, mongoose.connection. And I'm going to say, hey, when the connection is open, that's when I want you to run my code. Okay. Mongoose.connect. No, that should be mongoose.connection because it's the connection object that has those the .on function, and I should say .on. Okay, sloppy. Okay. There we go. Cool. And inside this callback is where I would just do any code I want to run. So in this case, what I want to do is I am going to want to run a query. And generally what you're going to want to do is you want to make sure this function is async. So whenever you're going to do Mongo stuff, you want to do it within the context of an async function. And that's generally for any database because all database operations are typically asynchronous because generally the database server is separate from your application. It's a whole separate program that's running separately. So when you communicate with it, you have no idea when it's going to get back to you. It could take a millisecond, could take 100 milliseconds. So you're not going to want to block your whole program waiting for it to respond, especially when you have hundreds and hundreds of requests coming in, if not more. Okay, so generally what you want to do is it's going to get wrapped. So basically Mongoose will wrap the results of everything we send over to Mongo in a promise. So that way we can handle it once it's complete. So you can either use the .then promise syntax, which I'll show an example of that too, okay, or you can use async await, which is much easier. So I'll show you the difference so you can appreciate why this is simpler. So actually, first what I'll do is I'll do the .then one first, just so that way you go from harder to easier. So let's say I wanted to create some data. Okay, what I'll do is I'll create a person. So we'll say const person equals, and it has to match the schema. So again, our schema has a property of age, which is 38. And again, it doesn't really matter what order you write these in. And name, AlexMerced. Now what I can do is I can say person dot create. Okay, and then I can pass in the person. Now I would want to wait till this is done, and I want to save the result. So I'm going to say, hey, const result equals person dot create person. And again, I'm going to hit on wait here, because anytime you do something with the database, you want to wait for that. In the context of this function, I want to wait for the database to finish making the person, so that way I get the result back. Okay, and then I can, oh, that's right. I didn't, my bad. I forgot that we're doing the .then version first. So in that case, the way this would work is that instead of awaiting, I would use the .then. So I would say, hey, .then, and then this would get the result, and then I can do what I want to do in here. So I would just console.log the result. And in case there's an error, I'd want to do a .catch. Okay, and that would handle the error. So that would also get a callback. Okay, and if that receives an error, we're going to want to console.log the error. So again, if something goes wrong, I'll know what happens because of the .catch block. If the database queries successfully, then it will do the following. Okay, so now this code should work. So I'm going to, now what I'm going to do is run the query file. So I'm going to say node query.js. Okay, and it worked. As you can see here, it created a person. So we can see it created a person object successfully and it logged it. Okay, notice now it's not just my name and ID. Mongo is always going to create an underscore ID property for everything. Okay, it always indexes everything based on that. An index is just a separate data structure that allows a database to more quickly find things. Think of it as like the index in the back of a book. The index in the back of the book isn't the actual book, but it helps you find things in the book faster. So it generally creates an index on this ID property, because typically when you're working, the kind of data that it's really optimized for is finding like specific items. Like I'm looking for a specific transaction from your financial records, or I'm looking for a specific user. So basically by indexing on the ID, you can find those specific things you want to update, delete really, really fast. Okay. You can create indexes on other properties, but again, always be careful. Too much indexing will actually slow things down when you write new data, because every time you write new data, it would have to update each index as well. Okay. Now remember I did those timestamps. Well, here they are. Those are the timestamps telling me when this was created and when was the last time this was updated. And then anytime it updates, this version number will go up. So we can actually see what version of this object we're looking at. So if it's version 100, we know this object has changed 100 times. Okay. Cool. Now I'm going to hit Control C because again, the Mongo connection is still open, which is eating up my terminal. So to turn it off, I just hit Control C. So now that's how you would do it using just normal .then syntax. With that, you don't need to put the async here. But now if I do put the async there, the way this would look like then is that this would just basically be a normal line of code. And I would just say const result equals await person.create. And then I can just console.log result. And you can see that's generally cleaner. I still probably want to handle that error. So I can still just add a quick .catch here and just handle the error real quick, just in case. Okay. That works. Okay. But you can see here, I'm going to go get the data, console log the result. Unless there's an error, then this .catch will run. There's a couple different ways you can handle the error. You can also wrap it in a try catch block. I'll probably do that in the next example. But here we go. So now we run that code again, and I'll create another person, which is the same person again. Okay, but you'll notice this is a new person because it's going to have a unique ID. So this ID does not match this ID. Okay, so we have two people in our database. So what happens if I wanted to look for all the people in my database? Okay, so you notice that person object has these functions that allows me to work. So you see, once I have it all set up, it's pretty simple. Okay, so now if it's async, I can say, hey, I want to go find all the people. I'll say const people equals await person dot find, and then you have to pass it in an object. This object acts as your filter. Okay, So maybe you only want to find like a specific person, like maybe I only want to find someone with like a specific age. Like, hey, I only want someone with the age of, 37. In this case, it would find me all the people with the age of 37. But when I pass an empty object, that means everything. Okay, so it's going to give me all people. And then since I waited, I can then just console.log people. Now again, I didn't handle any potential errors. So if I want to handle any potential errors, one thing I can do is I can just wrap this entire code block in a try block. So that way, if I have multiple calls to Mongoose, I only have one try block. And then I can do a catch right down there. And that a catch block will then handle the error. Console.log the error. Okay, let me just hit save. Okay, and that's kind of how it will look like. So again, it's going to do this code, the try code. And if nothing goes wrong, that's it. But if something goes wrong, then the error gets passed to this catch block. And then I can do whatever I want with the error. Okay? Which actually typically what I want to console log is really error.message. Assuming they throw me an actual error object. Okay? Cool. With that, let's run that. I'm going to hit Control-C to close off that connection. Rerun the file. Okay, and you see I got an array of people. And you see we can find our 2 people in there. Okay, so let me just make this bigger so you can kind of really see that more clearly. There's the data we got back. Cool. And that's generally how you work with Mongoose. Now, if I wanted to update that data, okay, all I would do is I would say, hey, I'll grab the ID of this person. Okay, and I'll say, hey, find, instead of people.find, I'm going to say, hey, const updated person equals person dot find by ID and update. Then I pass it the ID. Okay, so there's the ID. And then I'm going to pass it what I want it to update. So I'm going to say, hey, I want you to update the age. Let's make me younger. Let's update the age to 37. Okay. And then, okay, what you're going to want to do is in this third object is like a configuration object. And I'm going to want to make new true. The reason being is that just an odd way this function works is that when you run this function, it's going to return the old version of the object by default. When you set this property of new to true as this third argument, what it does, it tells the function, don't send back the old object, send back the new version, the new updated version, which is what we want. So then I can go console log updated person. Okay. Cool. So you see, I'm saying, hey, this is the when I want to update the ID. Here are the updates I want to apply, and please send me back the new one, not the old one. So now if I close out my previous connection and reopen it, or rerun the file, okay, I got, okay, so you see this, all this output, how I got this really big object? This is because the promise never resolved before this whole thing played out. Why? Because I forgot the keyword await. I forgot to await. Okay, I forgot to wait for the database to finish. Okay, so I ended up getting the query object back. So let me run that again. And now we get back the updated object. And see, now I've been de-aged back down to 37. Okay, let's just do more of that. Okay, now what if I want to delete me? Okay, this is pretty much the same deal, except I don't really need this. I would still need the ID, but it would be find by ID and delete. Okay, find by ID and delete. Then again, I can just run this. And what's going to happen is that technically what you're going to get back is the deleted person. This function returns the thing you deleted. So I'm going to capture that so we can see that, confirm that we deleted it. And run this file again. And there it is. That version of the younger version of Alex has been deleted. Que triste. Okay, wonderful. Now that is that. Okay, there are a lot of different functions in this person object. So for example, if I just type in person dot, okay, it's going to give me a list of all the things I can find inside of this Mongoose model object. So you can see here I can define all the things that match a query, or if I want to find one specific thing, it's going to find me the first thing that matches. Or if I want to look for a specific thing based on its ID, I can just give it the ID and it will get it for me. Okay, there's these functions where you can kind of like chain together different clauses to kind of create a query. Okay, add listener. Okay, so this is for like to listen to events on the object, like if it's updated or something. Apply, call the function. Well, let's see if there's anything else good in there. Bulk save, bulk write. So that's if you want to like just make a bunch of changes. Or if you just want to get the number of documents that exist. Okay, create. If you want to create one. Here, if you want to create a new collection, or if you want to create an index. Okay, here if you want to delete a lot of things, or versus delete just one thing. Okay, a lot of these are like more advanced, like database concepts. Okay, here you can emit events, so that way you can emit a particular event to trigger other code. Yeah, and there's all the find ones and replace and delete and update. Okay, insert many. So if you want to put in like many different things, you could just use create to do that. Create will let you can pass an array to create, and it will insert all of them. You can go get the list of any indexes that are on that particular collection. Yeah, so there's a lot of stuff here. Again, you most of this stuff you'll rarely, if ever, use, but it's good to know about it. Okay, I mean the next big thing you'd want to learn would be about Mongoose relationships. I do have other videos on them. They're actually some of the most popular videos I have. I would recommend watching those, just because I mean at this point this video is already running pretty long. But hopefully now you've learned how to get set up with the Mongoose and Mongo, have a better understanding of working with databases in general, with whatever programming language you want, and you're off to the races. So have a great day. I'll see you around.